If you remember the intoxicating smell of mimeograph paper or the metallic symphony of lunchboxes clanging through hallways, welcome home to 1980s classrooms.
The children will stay at the primary school until they're about 11.
This wasn't the sanitized digital age. This was when school supplies had weight, character, and yes, the potential to draw blood. A time when learning was tactile, mistakes were permanent, and every pencil sharpening was a small ritual. If you survived the 80s, these 30 items weren't just supplies, they were the tools that shaped us. Artifacts of a childhood when school still had edges sharp enough to teach you something real. Before we decided that protecting kids from every paper cut was more important than preparing them for a world that doesn't come with warning labels or participation trophies. Let's start with the king of all 1980s school supplies, the Trapper Keeper. This wasn't just a binder, it was a status symbol, an organizational system, and a fashion statement all rolled into one plastic package that came in wild colors and patterns you'd never see in stores today. The experience of owning a Trapper Keeper was pure 80s magic. The satisfying rip of the Velcro closure when you opened it, loud enough to disrupt an entire classroom. The slick plastic cover decorated with geometric shapes, sports cars, kittens, or whatever design spoke to your soul. Inside, the rings that actually trapped your papers instead of letting them fall out like regular binders, the built-in folders with the Trapper Keeper logo, perfectly sized to organize your subjects. These binders were huge and heavy, taking up half your desk. Teachers either loved them for keeping kids organized or hated them for that Velcro noise that happened 50 times during class. The plastic would crack after a year of use, the Velcro would get fuzzy and stop sticking, but while it lasted, your Trapper Keeper was your most prized school possession. Today's kids, with their thin folders and digital files, have no idea what they're missing. In the 1980s, pencil boxes weren't made of flimsy plastic. They were metal containers that could survive being dropped, stepped on, or thrown across the room. These rectangular tin boxes had hinged lids and came decorated with everything from Star Wars to Rainbow Bright, and they were basically indestructible. The sensory experience was all about sound and weight, the metallic click when you opened the lid, the rattle of pencils rolling around inside, the satisfying clang when you accidentally knocked it off your desk, the sharp corners that could poke you if you weren't careful, the way the paint would chip off over time, showing the silver metal underneath, the smell of metal mixed with eraser dust and pencil shavings. Kids would customize their metal pencil boxes with stickers, turning them into personal art projects. The boxes would dent, but never break, lasting years instead of months. They were heavy enough to use as a weapon in a pencil box fight, which definitely happened. Today's soft plastic pencil pouches that rip after a month would have been laughed at in the 80s. We had pencil boxes that could outlive us. The 1980s was the golden age of scented erasers. Small rubber erasers shaped like everything imaginable and infused with smells that were supposedly related to what they looked like. You'd have a strawberry-shaped eraser that smelled like fake strawberries, a pizza slice that smelled like chemicals pretending to be pizza, a hamburger that smelled like nothing found in nature. The experience of using scented erasers was weird and wonderful. Opening your pencil box and being hit with a wave of artificial fruit smell mixed with rubber. Holding a tiny eraser shaped like a bunch of grapes up to your nose to smell it for the 100th time. Trying to actually erase with these things and discovering they didn't work, they just smeared graphite around and left colored streaks on your paper. Kids collected scented erasers like trading cards, accumulating dozens that they'd never actually use for erasing. You'd trade them at recess, show them off to friends, organize them by smell or shape. Teachers hated them because kids would spend class time smelling erasers instead of paying attention. The erasers would eventually lose their scent, becoming just weird-shaped rubber objects, but while they smelled, they were treasures. Today's kids have never experienced the joy of a hamburger-scented eraser that doesn't actually erase. Before photocopiers were in every school, teachers used mimeograph machines to make copies, and the paper that came out was unlike anything kids today have experienced. The sheets would be slightly damp, covered in purple-blue ink, and they'd smell like chemicals in a way that was somehow addictive. The ritual was the same in every classroom. The teacher would hand out fresh mimeograph papers, and every kid would immediately hold it up to their nose and take a deep breath. That smell, sharp, chemical, slightly sweet, was the smell of school in the 1980s. The ink would be wet enough to smudge if you touched it too soon. The paper would feel cool and damp in your hands. Sometimes the copies would be faded or streaky, making parts of the worksheet hard to read. The smell came from the chemicals used in the mimeograph process, and looking back, it probably wasn't great that kids were huffing these fumes, but in the moment it was just what school smelled like. You'd do your worksheet on this purple-tinted paper, and by the time you got home, the smell would be gone and the ink would be dry. Today's crisp laser-printed handouts have no smell, no personality, no soul. They're just paper, and they're boring. Lunchboxes in the 1980s were made of metal, featured your favorite TV shows or movies, and were heavy enough to cause serious damage if swung at someone's head. These weren't insulated soft bags. These were metal boxes with metal handles and metal clasps, and they were everywhere in elementary school. The experience started in the morning, grabbing your metal lunchbox by its handle, feeling the weight of your sandwich and thermos inside. The metallic smell mixed with whatever your mom had packed, the way it would bang against your leg as you walked to school, the distinctive sound of dozens of metal lunchboxes clanging in the hallway as kids put them in their lockers or cubbies. Your lunchbox announced your personality: He-Man, Strawberry Shortcake, Star Wars, Dukes of Hazzard, whatever you were into. The metal would dent when you dropped it, but it wouldn't break. The paint would chip off the corners. Inside, you'd have a matching thermos, also made of metal or glass, that would keep your drink cold or hot, but would shatter if you dropped it wrong. Lunchbox fights were a real thing, and they could hurt. By the mid-'80s, schools started banning metal lunchboxes because they were considered weapons. Today's soft insulated bags are safer, but way less cool. 5 items down, and we're just getting started. What comes next gets weirder. The writing tools that could hurt you, the art supplies that were basically toxic, the technology that seems prehistoric now. Item 11 sat in every classroom, and using it wrong could leave permanent marks on your hands. In the 1980s, mechanical pencils weren't the standard yet, so you used regular wooden pencils that needed constant sharpening. Every classroom had a pencil sharpener, either a small handheld one or a big one mounted on the wall, and the sound of pencil sharpening was the soundtrack of school. The wall-mounted sharpeners were the best. You'd stick your pencil in the hole and crank the handle, watching through the clear plastic as the shavings curled into the container. The grinding sound, the smell of fresh wood and graphite, the way you'd over-sharpen your pencil until it was needle-sharp just because it was satisfying. Teachers would get mad at kids for sharpening pencils too much, wasting them down to tiny stubs. The handheld sharpeners were less fun, but more personal. They'd get dull quickly. Chewing up your pencil instead of sharpening it, the shavings would get stuck inside, requiring you to dig them out with another pencil. Some kids would sharpen their pencils into weapons, creating points sharp enough to stab through paper. Today's kids use mechanical pencils that never need sharpening, and they'll never know the satisfaction of a perfectly sharpened pencil or the frustration of breaking the tip immediately after sharpening. Before 3-ring binders became standard, many kids used 2-pocket folders with metal prongs in the middle. These prongs were supposed to hold your paper in place, but mostly they just ripped holes in everything and stabbed your fingers when you weren't careful. You'd open your folder and see those two metal prongs sticking up, ready to cause problems. To use them, you had to punch holes in your paper, usually with a single-hole punch that never lined up right, and then push the prongs through the holes. The prongs would bend and twist, never quite straightening back out. The paper would rip at the holes, especially if you tried to remove it from the prongs. Your fingers would get scratched by the sharp metal edges. The folders themselves were made of thin cardboard that would bend and tear. The pockets would split at the bottom, dropping your papers on the floor. But they cost like 50 cents, so that's what everyone used. Some folders had cool designs on the front. Lisa Frank, sports teams, rock bands, that would fade and peel off over time. Today's folders are simpler and safer, but they're also less likely to cause minor injuries, which somehow made school less interesting. Every kid in the 1980s had a ruler, usually a 12-inch wooden or plastic one, and while they were supposed to be for measuring, they were mostly used for ruler wars. You'd hold one end of the ruler on your desk, pull back the other end, and let it snap forward to launch erasers, paper wads, or just to make noise. The wooden rulers were the best for this, thick, sturdy, with metal edges for extra accuracy in measuring. The sound they made when you smacked them on your desk. The way you could use them as swords, having ruler fights with your friends when the teacher wasn't looking. The plastic rulers were more flexible, better for launching things, but easier to break. Rulers also served as fidget toys before fidget toys existed. You'd balance them on your finger, spin them on your desk, use them to tap out rhythms. Teachers would confiscate rulers from kids who were using them for non-measuring purposes. The metal-edged wooden rulers could actually hurt if you got hit with one, which is probably why schools eventually switched to plastic-only rulers. Today's rulers are safer and less fun, which seems to be the theme of modern school supplies. Before glue sticks, elementary schools used paste, white, gooey paste that came in small jars with orange lids and flat wooden applicators. The paste was non-toxic, which was good because some kids would eat it. Not because it tasted good, it didn't, but because it was there and they were kids. The experience of using paste was messy and weird, unscrewing the orange lid, the smell of paste that was vaguely minty but mostly just chemical, dipping the wooden stick into the jar and scooping out a glob of white paste, spreading it on your paper where it would go on thick and bumpy, trying to stick two pieces of paper together and having the paste squeeze out the sides, getting paste all over your fingers, your desk, your clothes. The paste would dry out if you left the lid off, forming a crusty layer on top that you'd have to dig through to reach the good paste underneath. It didn't stick things together very well. Your art projects would fall apart before you got them home, but it was what schools used because it was cheap and safe to eat, even though eating it was discouraged. Today's glue sticks are cleaner, more effective, and less likely to be consumed by students. Every classroom in the 1980s had an overhead projector, a big machine that sat on a cart and projected transparent sheets onto a screen or wall. Teachers would write on these clear plastic sheets with special markers, and the projector would shine the image onto the screen so everyone could see it. The experience of the overhead projector was all about heat and light, the bright bulb inside that would warm up the whole machine, making the glass top hot enough to burn your hand if you touched it, the loud fan that would run constantly, trying to keep the bulb from overheating, the smell of hot plastic when the projector had been on too long, the way dust would show up in the projected light, floating through the beam like tiny spaceships. Teachers would stack their transparency sheets on top of the projector, and the heat would make them curl and stick together. Sometimes the bulb would burn out in the middle of class, requiring someone to go get a replacement bulb. Kids thought it was cool when they got to write on the transparencies or operate the projector. The projected image was never quite in focus, and there was always a glare from the windows that made it hard to see. Today's teachers use digital projectors connected to computers, which are better in every way except nostalgia. The overhead projector was clunky and hot and unreliable, but it was what we had, and somehow we all survived. 10 items deep, and the 80s classroom is coming into focus, a place of metal, heat, and supplies that could hurt you. But we're just getting to the really weird stuff. The technology that seems ancient now, the art supplies that were definitely toxic, the safety hazards that nobody thought were hazardous. Item 16 was in every school, and it created fumes that probably shouldn't have been in buildings with children. For kids who held their pencils wrong or whose hands got tired from writing, there were pencil grips, triangular pieces of foam or rubber that slid onto your pencil to make it easier to hold. These grips came in neon colors and felt weird and squishy. The foam ones would compress when you squeezed them, then slowly expand back to their original shape. They'd get dirty quickly, collecting pencil dust and hand oils until they were gray and gross. The rubber ones were firmer, but would develop cracks and tears. Both kinds would slide up and down your pencil, never staying where you put them. Teachers would force kids to use pencil grips if their handwriting was bad, trying to correct their grip. Some kids liked them, finding them comfortable. Others hated them, finding them awkward and weird feeling. The grips would fall off and get lost, roll under desks, get chewed on by bored students. Today's pencil grips are more advanced and ergonomic, but the weird foam triangles of the 80s were a classroom staple. In the 1980s, textbooks were expensive and had to last for years, so schools required students to cover their books to protect them. The standard method was to cut up paper grocery bags and fold them around your books, creating custom-fitted covers. The process was an art form, cutting the bag to the right size, folding it around the book, creasing the edges, tucking in the flaps. Your mom would help you do it at the beginning of the school year, covering all your textbooks in brown paper. Then you'd decorate the covers with markers, writing your name, drawing pictures, doodling band logos. The paper bag covers would get torn and dirty over the school year. The corners would wear through first, requiring patches or replacement covers. Some kids would use wallpaper or wrapping paper instead of bags, creating fancier covers. The covers would slip off if you didn't secure them well, requiring readjustment. By the end of the year, your book covers would be covered in doodles, phone numbers, and random notes. Today's textbooks often come with built-in plastic covers, or kids use stretchy fabric covers, but the paper bag method was pure 80s resourcefulness. Geometry class in the 1980s required a compass, not the kind that shows direction, but the kind with two legs, one with a sharp metal point, and one with a pencil holder, used for drawing circles. These compasses had legitimately dangerous sharp points that could stab through paper and into desks, or into people. The metal point was needle-sharp, designed to anchor the compass to your paper while you swung the pencil leg around to draw a perfect circle. You'd press the point into your paper, and it would punch a small hole. Press too hard, and you'd stab through your paper, through your notebook, and into the desk, leaving a permanent mark. Drop your compass, and the point could stick into your leg or foot. Kids would use compasses as weapons, poking each other, threatening to stab, treating them like tiny swords. Teachers would warn students to be careful, but injuries still happened. The compasses came in sets with protractors and triangles, all stored in hard plastic cases. The pencil holder would never quite grip the pencil tight enough, so it would slip while you were drawing. Today's compasses often have safety points that aren't as sharp, making them less dangerous but also less effective. Before smartphones and tablets, calculators were separate devices that did one thing: math. The calculators of the early 1980s were thick, heavy, and ran on batteries that would die at the worst possible times, usually during a test. These calculators had physical buttons that clicked when you pressed them, a small LED or LCD display that showed maybe 8 digits, and they could do basic functions: addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, maybe square roots if you were fancy. The buttons would stick or stop working after heavy use. The display would fade when the batteries got low, making the numbers hard to read. Kids would spell words on their calculators by typing numbers and turning the calculator upside down. 07734 became hello. 531080008 became something that would make everyone laugh. Teachers would specify which calculators were allowed for tests, banning the fancy graphing calculators that only rich kids had. The simple 4-function calculators were cheap and reliable, but they were also boring and limited. The pink pearl eraser was the gold standard of erasers in the 1980s, a large, rectangular, pink rubber eraser that actually worked and had a distinctive smell that every kid loved. These weren't the cheap erasers on the end of pencils that just smeared graphite around. These were serious erasers that could remove mistakes. The sensory experience was all about texture and smell, the soft pink rubber that felt almost powdery, the way it would crumble as you erased, leaving little pink rubber worms on your paper that you'd have to brush away. The smell, sweet, rubbery, chemical, that you'd sniff intentionally because it was weirdly pleasant. The satisfying feeling of watching your mistake disappear under the pink pearl's power. These erasers would get dirty over time, the pink turning gray from use. Kids would carve them with pencils, cutting designs, or initials into the rubber. They'd use them to play eraser tag, flicking them across desks. Teachers would confiscate pink pearls from students who were playing with them instead of using them for their intended purpose. 15 down, halfway through our journey into 1980s school supplies. The next section gets into technology that's now extinct, art supplies that were probably hazardous, and organizational tools that would confuse modern students. Item 21 was revolutionary at the time, but is now completely obsolete. The ditto machine was similar to the mimeograph, but used different chemicals, and the smell was even more intense. Teachers would make copies using ditto fluid, and the papers would come out purple and smelling so strong that it would make kids dizzy if they sniffed too long. The fluid was alcohol-based, which explained the intense smell and the lightheaded feeling. Kids would hold the paper up to their noses and breathe deeply, getting a little high off the fumes. Teachers knew kids did this, but couldn't really stop it. The smell was unavoidable, and the papers had to be handed out. The purple ink would fade over time, making old ditto papers hard to read. Looking back, having kids intentionally inhale chemical fumes was probably not great, but in the 80s it was just part of school. The ditto machine eventually got replaced by photocopiers, and the distinctive smell disappeared from schools. Right before computers, students who wanted typed papers had to use typewriters, and fixing mistakes meant using correction tape, a white ribbon that you'd type over your error to cover it up. The correction tape never worked as well as advertised. You'd make a typo, backspace, switch to the correction tape, and type the wrong letter again, hoping the white tape would cover it. Sometimes it would work, leaving a white smudge where the mistake had been. Other times, the correction tape wouldn't cover completely, leaving a ghost of the original letter. You'd type your correction over the white smudge, and it would be obvious that a mistake had been made there. The correction tape would run out at the worst times, usually when you were typing a final draft due the next day. The tape would get tangled in the typewriter, requiring careful extraction. Some kids used correction fluid instead, thick white paint that you'd brush over mistakes, but that took forever to dry and would flake off if you touched it. In every student in the 1980s had an assignment book, a small notebook where you'd write down your homework assignments for each class. There were no online portals, no apps, no digital calendars. If you wanted to remember your homework, you had to write it down. The assignment books had a week-per-page layout, with spaces for each subject. You'd write your assignments during class, hopefully accurately, and then check your book when you got home to see what you needed to do. If you forgot to write something down, you had to call a friend and ask, which meant knowing phone numbers and being willing to talk on the phone. Kids would doodle in their assignment books, turning them into art projects. The books would get bent and torn from being shoved into backpacks. Pages would fall out, taking your assignments with them. Some kids were diligent about using their assignment books, while others would lose them immediately and just hope they remembered their homework. Today's students have their assignments posted online with reminders and notifications, but the physical assignment book taught responsibility in a way that digital systems don't. Geometry required protractors, semicircular or circular tools for measuring angles. The protractors in the 1980s were made of thin, clear plastic that would crack and break if you looked at them wrong. The plastic was so thin you could bend it, and if you bent it too far, it would crack. The printed degree markings would wear off over time, making the protractor useless. The little hole in the center that you were supposed to line up with the vertex of your angle was never quite in the right place. Using a protractor required precision that the cheap plastic design didn't support. Kids would use protractors as toys, spinning them on their pencils, using them as mini frisbees, bending them until they snapped. The marble composition notebook was everywhere in the 1980s, a wide-ruled notebook with a distinctive black and white marbled cover and a white label where you'd write your name and subject. These notebooks were cheap, durable, and completely standard. The covers were made of thick cardboard with a glossy coating that would peel off at the corners over time. The binding was sewn, not spiral, so pages wouldn't fall out easily. The paper was decent quality, and the wide ruling made it easy to write. The white label on the front would get filled with your name, your teacher's name, the subject, and whatever else you wanted to add. Kids would customize their marble notebooks with stickers covering the marbled pattern completely. The notebooks would get bent and battered in backpacks, but they'd hold together. Teachers would require specific notebooks for specific subjects, and you'd end up with a stack of marble notebooks for different classes. Today's notebooks come in more varieties, but the classic marble composition notebook is still around, proving that some school supplies are timeless. By the mid to late 1980s, computers were starting to appear in schools, and with them came floppy disks. The 5.25-inch kind that were actually floppy, not the hard plastic 3.5-inch disks that came later. These disks stored a whopping 360 kilobytes of data, which seemed like a lot at the time. The disks were square, made of thin plastic that would bend if you weren't careful, with a circular magnetic disk inside that spun when you inserted it into the drive. They had a rectangular notch cut out on one side and an oval cutout in the center. You could actually feel the magnetic disk moving inside the plastic sleeve. The disks were fragile and would fail for mysterious reasons. Touching the magnetic surface, bending them, exposing them to magnets, or just looking at them wrong. You'd save your work on a floppy disk, and the next day it wouldn't work, and you'd lose everything. Teachers would tell students to make backup copies, but who had two floppy disks? The disks came in boxes and had labels where you'd write what was saved on them. Today's USB drives and cloud storage hold millions of times more data and are infinitely more reliable, but floppy disks were the cutting edge of school technology in the 80s. Before online databases, school libraries used card catalogs, large wooden cabinets filled with small drawers, each containing hundreds of index cards with information about books. Finding a book meant knowing how to use the card catalog system. Each drawer was labeled with letters or subjects, and inside were cards organized alphabetically. You'd pull open a drawer. It would slide smoothly on metal rails, and flip through the cards looking for your book. The cards had the title, author, subject, and most importantly, the call number that told you where to find the book on the shelves. The system required knowing whether to search by author, title, or subject, and then knowing the alphabet well enough to find the right card. The drawers would stick sometimes, or cards would be misfiled, making books impossible to find. The wooden cabinets were beautiful pieces of furniture, and the ritual of using them was satisfying in a way that typing into a search box isn't. Libraries started replacing card catalogs with computers in the late 80s and early 90s, and the wooden cabinets disappeared. Today's students search online and have no idea what they're missing. Research in the 1980s meant using encyclopedias, massive sets of books organized alphabetically, with each volume covering a range of topics. School libraries and many homes had encyclopedia sets, and they were the primary source of information for reports and projects. The most common sets were World Book or Encyclopedia Britannica, with 20-30 volumes covering everything from A to Z. The books were heavy, with thin paper and small print. You'd look up your topic in the index, find the right volume, and flip through looking for information. Then you'd take notes by hand, copying facts and quotes onto notebook paper. The encyclopedias were always out of date. The newest volume might be a few years old, and older volumes could be decades old. Information about current events was limited to whatever had been published before the encyclopedia was printed. Some sets had yearbooks that updated information annually, but those were expensive. Today's students use Wikipedia and online sources, getting instant access to current information. But there was something satisfying about the weight of an encyclopedia volume, the smell of old paper, the feeling of being surrounded by knowledge in physical form. Wall-mounted pencil sharpeners were standard in every classroom, but they had a terrible habit of eating pencils, chewing them up instead of sharpening them, especially once the blades got dull. You'd stick your pencil in the sharpener, crank the handle, and watch as your pencil got shorter and shorter without getting any sharper. The mechanism would jam, requiring someone to take apart the sharpener and clear out the blockage of wood shavings and graphite. The blade would get loose, causing it to cut unevenly and create pencils with lopsided points. Sometimes the sharpener would grab your pencil and refuse to let go, requiring you to wiggle and pull until it released. Teachers would get frustrated at students who sharpened their pencils down to nubs, wasting them. Some classrooms had rules about when you were allowed to sharpen pencils, only before class or during work time, never during instruction. The sound of a pencil sharpener was so common that teachers learned to talk over it. Electric pencil sharpeners were fancy and rare, found only in the most well-funded classrooms. Today's students have better sharpeners, but they also use mechanical pencils more often, avoiding the sharpening problem entirely. Projects and collages in the 1980s often required rubber cement, a thick, sticky adhesive that came in jars with brushes attached to the lids. Rubber cement was messy, smelly, and would get everywhere. The cement was yellowish and gooey, with a strong chemical smell that would fill the classroom. You'd brush it onto your paper, and it would go on thick and wet. If you got it on your fingers, which you always did, it would dry into a rubbery film that you could peel off, which was satisfying, but meant you weren't doing your project. The cement would form strings and globs, sticking to everything. One benefit of rubber cement was that mistakes could be fixed. You could rub the dried cement off with your finger or an eraser, but this also meant your projects would fall apart if you rubbed them too hard. The cement would yellow over time, staining your artwork. The jars would dry out if you didn't seal them properly, and the brush would get stiff and useless. Today's glue sticks and tape are cleaner and easier, but rubber cement had a certain creative chaos. Before delete keys, fixing mistakes on typed or written work meant using whiteout, thick white liquid that you'd paint over your errors. The most common brand was whiteout, and it was both essential and frustrating. The whiteout came in small bottles with brushes attached to the caps, similar to nail polish. You'd shake the bottle, unscrew the cap, and carefully paint over your mistake. The liquid would go on thick and white, covering your error. Then you'd have to wait for it to dry, which took forever. If you tried to write over it too soon, your pen would smear the whiteout and make things worse. The whiteout would dry out in the bottle, becoming thick and clumpy. You could add thinner to revive it, but that just delayed the inevitable. The dried whiteout on your paper would be raised and obvious, announcing to everyone that you'd made a mistake there. Sometimes the whiteout would crack or flake off, revealing your original error. Despite these problems, whiteout was essential for anyone who typed or wrote in pen. Four-color pens were the height of pen technology in the 1980s. One pen barrel with 4 different colored ink cartridges, usually black, blue, red, and green, that you could switch between by clicking different buttons on the side. These pens were fun, practical, and always breaking. The mechanism was simple. Click the button for the color you wanted, and that ink cartridge would extend while the others retracted. You could color-code your notes, switching between colors for different subjects or types of information. The pens felt sophisticated and professional, like something an adult would use. The problem started when multiple colors would get stuck in the extended position, making the pen unusable. Or one color would run out while the others still had ink, but you couldn't replace just one cartridge. The buttons would break, leaving a color permanently extended or retracted. Kids would click the buttons rapidly, making all the colors extend at once, which would jam the mechanism. Despite these issues, 4-color pens were popular and cool. Finished reports and projects were presented in report covers, folders with a clear plastic front that showed your title page and a colored back that came in various colors. These covers made your work look professional and protected it from damage. The covers had 3 metal prongs inside that matched the holes in 3-hole punched paper. You'd punch holes in your report, slide it onto the prongs, and bend the prongs flat to hold everything in place. The clear plastic front would show your carefully designed title page, making your report look official and important. The plastic would scratch and crack over time. The prongs would bend and break, making them impossible to use. The colored backs would fade and tear. But for the moment when you turned in your report, the cover made it look good. Teachers would sometimes require specific colors for different assignments. In the 1980s, if you needed to leave the classroom, you had to take a hall pass, a physical object that proved you had permission to be in the hallway. These passes varied by school, but were often wooden block, oversized keychains, or laminated cards. The passes were intentionally awkward and embarrassing. A large wooden block with "Hall Pass" written on it, too big to fit in your pocket. A giant fake key on a chain that you had to carry. A laminated card that announced to everyone what you were doing. The point was to discourage students from asking to leave class unless they really needed to. Teachers would have different passes for different purposes: bathroom pass, office pass, nurse pass. You'd have to ask permission, then carry this embarrassing object through the halls. The passes would get dirty and gross, especially the bathroom passes, because hundreds of students handled them. Today's schools use various systems: paper passes, digital passes, or just permission. But the physical hall pass was a uniquely 80s form of bathroom regulation. The final item is the most pointless. Pencil toppers, small rubber or plastic figures that fit on the eraser end of your pencil. These served absolutely no functional purpose but were everywhere in the 1980s. In a decade defined by excess and consumerism, where even the most utilitarian objects became opportunities for decoration and personalization, pencil toppers represented the ultimate triumph of form over function, of desire over necessity, of pure aesthetic pleasure over practical utility. Pencil toppers came in every imaginable shape: animals, monsters, cartoon characters, food items, sports equipment. They were colorful, collectible, and completely useless. They made your pencil top-heavy and awkward to write with. They'd fall off constantly, rolling under desks and getting lost. Kids loved them anyway, and that love was pure and uncomplicated, untainted by any consideration of usefulness or practicality. The variety of pencil toppers available was staggering. You could find realistic animals, cats, dogs, horses, dolphins, rendered in soft rubber with surprising detail. You could find fantasy creatures, dragons, unicorns, trolls, in bright, unrealistic colors that appealed to children's sense of whimsy. You could find food items, hamburgers, ice cream cones, pizza slices that looked almost good enough to eat but were clearly made of plastic. You could find sports equipment, tiny basketballs, footballs, baseball bats that allowed you to display your athletic allegiances even while doing homework. The cartoon character pencil toppers were particularly popular, featuring whatever was currently dominating Saturday morning television or afternoon cartoons: Smurfs, Garfield, Pac-Man, Strawberry Shortcake, He-Man, My Little Pony. Whatever kids were watching, there were pencil toppers to match. These licensed character toppers cost more than the generic ones, but they were worth it for the social currency they provided. Having the latest cartoon character on your pencil meant you were current, that you knew what was popular, that you were part of the cultural conversation happening on playgrounds across America. Some pencil toppers were designed to look like miniature people, tiny figures with movable arms and legs, or static figures frozen in various poses. These were particularly popular with kids who liked to create narratives and scenarios, using their pencil toppers as characters in elaborate stories played out on desktops during boring lessons. The pencil became a stage, the topper became an actor, and suddenly math class was slightly more bearable because you had a tiny astronaut or princess keeping you company. The seasonal pencil toppers represented another major category. Halloween brought pencil toppers shaped like pumpkins, ghosts, witches, and black cats. Christmas meant Santa Claus, reindeer, snowmen, and Christmas trees. Valentine's Day featured hearts and cupids. Easter brought bunnies and eggs. These seasonal toppers allowed kids to participate in holiday celebrations even at school, to mark the passing of time and the rhythm of the year through the decorations on their pencils. The materials varied from cheap, hard plastic that would crack and break easily to soft, flexible rubber that could withstand being dropped, stepped on, and chewed on without suffering permanent damage. The soft rubber toppers were generally more expensive, but also more durable and more pleasant to touch. They had a slightly sticky quality that helped them stay on the pencil better than the hard plastic ones, though even the rubber toppers would eventually work loose and fall off with enough use. The attachment mechanism was simple but imperfect, a hole in the bottom of the topper that was sized to fit snugly over the metal ferrule and eraser of a standard pencil. When new, the fit was tight enough that the topper stayed in place reasonably well, but the hole would stretch out with repeated removal and replacement, and eventually the topper would become loose, sliding up and down the pencil or falling off entirely at the slightest provocation. This inevitable loosening meant that pencil toppers had a limited useful life, which of course meant you needed to keep buying new ones. They were colorful, collectible, and completely useless. The uselessness was actually part of the appeal. In a world where children were constantly told to be practical, to think about usefulness, to justify their desires with rational explanations, pencil toppers represented pure want when new, The fit was tight enough that the topper stayed in place reasonably well, but the hole would stretch out with repeated removal and replacement, and eventually the topper would become loose, sliding up and down the pencil or falling off entirely at the slightest provocation. This inevitable loosening meant that pencil toppers had a limited useful life, which of course meant you needed to keep buying new ones. They were colorful, collectible, and completely useless. The uselessness was actually part of the appeal. In a world where children were constantly told to be practical, to think about usefulness, to justify their desires with rational explanations, pencil toppers represented pure want, uncomplicated by need. You didn't need a pencil topper. It served no purpose. It made your pencil work worse, not better, but you wanted it anyway. And that wanting was its own justification. The collectible nature of pencil toppers created a whole economy within elementary schools. Kids would trade toppers like baseball cards, negotiating exchanges based on perceived rarity and desirability. A common animal topper might be worth 2 or 3 less desirable toppers. A rare licensed character topper might be worth 5 or 6 common ones. The trading happened at recess, during lunch, on the bus, wherever kids could gather and negotiate without adult supervision. Some kids became serious collectors, accumulating dozens or even hundreds of pencil toppers that they'd display at home in special containers or on shelves. These collections represented significant investments of allowance money and birthday gift requests. Parents would shake their heads at the accumulation of tiny plastic objects that served no purpose, but they'd usually indulge the collecting habit because it was relatively inexpensive and kept kids occupied and happy. They made your pencil top-heavy and awkward to write with. This was an undeniable fact that every kid who used pencil toppers had to acknowledge. The weight distribution of a pencil is carefully designed, heavier at the bottom where you grip it, lighter at the top. Adding a pencil topper reversed this balance, making the eraser end heavier than the writing end. This meant the pencil wanted to tip backward when you were writing, requiring you to grip it more tightly and adjust your writing angle to compensate. The awkwardness extended beyond just the weight. The topper made the pencil longer, which meant it stuck out farther when you were writing, making it more likely to bump into things or knock over your drink. The topper also made it harder to store the pencil in standard pencil boxes or desk organizers, which were designed for bare pencils without decorative additions. You'd have to remove the topper to make the pencil fit, which defeated the purpose of having it in the first place. They'd fall off constantly, rolling under desks and getting lost. This was perhaps the most frustrating aspect of pencil toppers. You'd be writing, focused on your work, and suddenly you'd feel the topper slip off. It would hit your desk with a small thud, then roll off the edge and disappear under your desk or your neighbor's desk or into some inaccessible corner of the classroom. You'd have to interrupt your work to search for it, getting down on your hands and knees to peer under furniture, disrupting the class and drawing attention to yourself. The rolling was particularly problematic because pencil toppers were specifically designed to roll. Most were round or cylindrical or had curved surfaces that made them perfect for rolling long distances across classroom floors. A topper that fell off your desk might roll all the way to the other side of the room, requiring an expedition to retrieve it. Some teachers had rules against students getting up during class to retrieve fallen pencil toppers, which meant you had to wait until the end of the period, by which time someone else might have picked it up, or it might have been kicked further away, or it might have simply disappeared into the mysterious void where lost classroom objects went. But kids loved them anyway. This love was genuine and enthusiastic, uncomplicated by the practical problems that pencil toppers created. Kids loved them because they were cute, because they were colorful, because they represented characters and objects that kids cared about, because they were collectible, because they were a form of self-expression in an environment that offered limited opportunities for personalization. You'd collect pencil toppers, trade them with friends, and cover all your pencils with them even though they made writing harder. Every pencil in your pencil box would have a topper, creating a small forest of decorative objects that made it difficult to find the pencil you actually wanted, but looked impressive and demonstrated your commitment to the aesthetic. You'd coordinate your toppers with your mood or your outfit or the season, changing them out regularly to keep things fresh and interesting. The trading culture around pencil toppers was sophisticated and complex. Kids developed elaborate systems for determining relative value, taking into account factors like rarity, condition, desirability of the character or design, and current trends. A pencil topper that was popular one month might be worthless the next if the associated cartoon show was canceled or if a new, cooler topper design came out. The trading taught kids about negotiation, about perceived value versus intrinsic value, about supply and demand, about the social dynamics of desire and possession. Teachers would confiscate them from students who were playing with them instead of working. This was inevitable and expected. The very qualities that made pencil toppers appealing to students, their bright colors, their interesting shapes, their tactile appeal, made them irresistible distractions during class time. A student who was supposed to be doing math problems would instead be making their pencil topper walk across their desk, or flying it through the air like a spaceship, or having conversations between multiple toppers arranged on the desktop. Teachers had different approaches to dealing with pencil toppers. Some banned them entirely, requiring students to remove all toppers before entering the classroom. These teachers saw pencil toppers as nothing but distractions with no educational value, and they had no patience for the disruptions they caused. Other teachers were more lenient, allowing pencil toppers as long as students weren't actively playing with them during instruction time. These teachers would confiscate toppers from students who were caught playing with them, storing the confiscated items in a drawer or box, and returning them at the end of the day or week. The most diplomatic teachers found ways to incorporate pencil toppers into classroom management. They might allow students to display their toppers on their desks as rewards for good behavior, or they might use pencil toppers as prizes for academic achievements. Some teachers even used pencil toppers as teaching tools, having students sort them by color or shape or size, or use them as manipulatives for math problems. These teachers understood that fighting against pencil toppers was futile, and that finding ways to work with students' interests was more effective than trying to suppress them entirely. The toppers would get chewed on, torn, and destroyed, but there were always more to buy. The destruction of pencil toppers was constant and inevitable. The soft rubber ones would get chewed by anxious students, developing tooth marks and eventually holes that made them unusable. The hard plastic ones would crack and break, losing arms or ears or other protruding parts. The paint or printed designs would wear off, leaving faded, ghostly images of what the topper had once been. The attachment holes would stretch out until the toppers wouldn't stay on pencils anymore. But this destruction didn't matter because pencil toppers were cheap and replaceable. You could buy them at any drugstore, grocery store, toy store, or school supply store. They were impulse purchases, the kind of thing you'd grab at the checkout counter while your mom was paying for groceries. They cost anywhere from 25 cents to $1, depending on size and licensing, which meant even kids with minimal allowances could afford them. The constant cycle of acquisition, use, destruction, and replacement was built into the pencil topper economy. They represented pure, pointless fun, a school supply that had no reason to exist except to make kids happy. This was their true purpose and their greatest achievement. In an educational system increasingly focused on standardized testing, measurable outcomes, and practical skills, pencil toppers represented a small rebellion, a tiny assertion that joy and beauty and fun had value even when they served no practical purpose. They were frivolous in the best possible way, a reminder that not everything needed to be useful to be worthwhile. Today's students have different distractions, but pencil toppers were the fidget spinners of the 1980s, except they actually made your school work harder instead of easier. This comparison is apt in several ways. Both pencil toppers and fidget spinners are small, inexpensive objects that became wildly popular among school-aged children despite serving no clear educational purpose. Both are collectible, with kids accumulating multiple versions and trading them with friends. Both are frequently banned or restricted by teachers who saw them as distractions rather than tools. But the comparison also highlights an important difference. Fidget spinners were marketed with claims about helping kids focus and manage anxiety, giving them a veneer of therapeutic legitimacy even if those claims were questionable. Pencil toppers made no such claims. They were honestly and straightforwardly useless, and everyone knew it. There was no pretense that they helped you write better or focus more effectively. They were pure decoration, pure fun, pure aesthetic pleasure, and they didn't apologize for it. The honesty of pencil toppers' uselessness was refreshing in a way. They didn't try to justify themselves with pseudo-scientific claims about improving concentration or reducing stress. They existed simply to be cute, to be collectible, to be a small source of joy in the school day. In an era before everything had to be optimized and justified and measured for its impact, pencil toppers could simply exist for their own sake, and that was enough. The 1980s was the last era of fully analog school supplies before computers and digital technology changed everything. These 30 items represent a world where school was physical, tactile, and sometimes dangerous. Modern students have supplies that are safer, more efficient, and more advanced. But they'll never experience the unique joys and frustrations of 1980s school life, the smell of mimeograph paper, the weight of a metal lunchbox, the satisfaction of a perfectly sharpened pencil, or the complete uselessness of a pencil topper that you loved anyway. Modern students have supplies that are safer, more efficient, and more advanced, and these improvements are generally positive. Digital textbooks are lighter and more accessible. Safety scissors prevent injuries. Mechanical pencils eliminate the need for sharpening. Online research is faster and more comprehensive than library research. These advances make education more efficient and more equitable in many ways. But something has been lost in the transition from analog to digital, from dangerous to safe, from inefficient to optimized. The physical connection to learning materials, the sensory richness of the classroom environment, the small risks that taught caution and respect, the imperfections that required problem-solving and adaptation. All of these things shaped the educational experience in ways that are hard to quantify, but were nonetheless real and valuable. They'll never experience the unique joys and frustrations of 1980s school life. The smell of mimeograph paper fresh off the machine, that distinctive chemical scent that every kid would immediately sniff when handed a worksheet, the weight of a metal lunchbox swinging from your hand as you walked to school, the satisfying clang it made when you set it down, the way it kept your sandwich from getting squished, the satisfaction of a perfectly sharpened pencil, the point so fine it could pierce paper, the wood shavings curling perfectly into the sharpener's reservoir, or the complete uselessness of a pencil topper that you loved anyway, that served no purpose except to make you smile, that represented the possibility of joy without justification, of beauty without utility, of wanting something simply because you wanted it and not because you needed it. These experiences weren't better or worse than what modern students experience. They were simply different, and in their difference, they represented a particular moment in educational history that is now past and will never return. The pencil topper, useless and beloved, stands as the perfect symbol of that era. Impractical, inefficient, occasionally frustrating, but somehow essential to the texture and feeling of what it meant to be a student in the 1980s, in that last moment before everything changed.